everybody. Welcome back for another episode of the Warm Up Podcast. Today I am here with a friend of mine. Her name is Amber Reimondo, and she is the Energy Director for the Grand Canyon Trust. The Grand Canyon Trust is an environmental nonprofit that's focused on safeguarding the Grand Canyon and the greater Colorado Plateau while supporting the rights of Native people. So I'm super honored to have Amber on here today, and I would love to just pass it over to you to do a quick introduction so you can say hello.
Hey Bree, thanks so much for having me on. My name is Amber Reimondo. I live in Flagstaff, Arizona, and I direct the energy program for the Grand Canyon Trust, which you just did a great job of giving an introduction to.
Yes, well, you did a great job of writing that up for me, so thank you. But I'm so excited to have you here, and obviously you're doing incredible things, and I've always admired the work that you've done, even beyond just like knowing you through the trail running community. Like, you just are making such a great wave and bringing up such important issues and shedding light on them for even like not even just people within our community and the Northern Arizonan community, but to large groups of people that are starting to call for advocacy, starting to pay attention, and that's all because of what you're doing. So I'm super honored to have you on here in this capacity. And I want to just start off by just having you talk about your background and like what got you interested in pursuing an undergraduate degree in environmental and natural resources to begin with, because I feel like this is such an amazing journey you've been on.
Yeah, thank you. Well, first of all, that's like really all super nice of you to say. I'm very flattered. I am originally from Wyoming. That's where I was born and raised. And so I don't know, a lot of people don't necessarily travel through Wyoming or know what it's like in Wyoming, but it's very wide open, a lot of public lands. I grew up on a small ranch that was off the grid, not because my parents were like trying to be off the grid. It just like legitimately did not have access to power or other like services that you would get in a town. So growing up out there, I mean, when you don't have the same access to like the power grid, TV is not always an option. Like things that people would do for entertainment in like modern society were not always available to me. And so I did spend a lot of time outside, and that was really formative for me. I am really lucky to have gotten that experience. And I went out, I often went out like camping and backpacking with my family in the Wind River Mountains. And I guess like what really first got me interested in environment and natural resource issues is that in the Green River Basin, the Upper Green River Basin, which is kind of like on the west flank of the Wind Rivers, I used to go up there all the time with my parents. I'd go hunting with my dad. And as I got into high school, I started noticing that all of that open space was being industrialized. And I didn't really know what exactly was happening. I mean, I was a teenager. I wasn't paying that much attention. But I soon learned that it was a booming gas field. And so really like in those 4 years of high school, I started to notice things changing from this like open space where we would go out and see wildlife and just feel like you're truly in the middle of nowhere to suddenly being in the middle of this spider web of gas wells. And everything from that experience out in nature to like my own experience in town changed a lot because we started to get an influx of a lot of gas field workers that weren't necessarily from there. They were making a lot of money and didn't really have anything better to do with it in a small town. And so there was just like loud place, for lack of better description, all of a sudden to be growing up in. And so yeah, that was really eye-opening to me. And even our own ranch south of Rock Springs, Wyoming, where I went to high school, one day this gas company shows up with like, they're called thumpers. They're these big pieces of machinery that go along the surface. They drive just right over everything, and they create kind of like an image of what's underground. They're searching for deposits. And it was shocking to me. I was like asking my parents why they let this happen, and they were like, well, we don't really have a choice. Like, that's kind of how split estate works. So you can own the surface, but you don't own the minerals. And so they have access to those minerals if they so choose. And so, yeah, that was like startling to me. And that's ultimately what got me really interested. And just as I started to learn more about it and the state that I was growing up in, Wyoming is a very energy reliant, energy focused state. And so whatever the coal companies want, whatever the oil and gas companies want, that's suddenly the priority for the state of Wyoming. And so it just sort of evolved from there.
Yeah, that's really jarring to me too. I didn't realize that because I knew that you couldn't own technically what was underneath the land, but I didn't realize that they could just come on and say like, "Hey, we're going to go onto your land and look what's underneath." And if we did find something, would they have bought it out? Like, what does that look like if they do find
Oh
something?
gosh. Yeah, I think it depends. I've heard of some situations where like I think that they do have to offer you money, but I think ultimately if you say no and they decide to pursue anyway, I think they can just go for it. And oil and gas drilling all across the state was sort of like that. I don't know if people remember the Josh Fox documentary from, oh gosh, I don't even remember what year it was, but it was about Pavilion, Wyoming, groundwater contamination that had come from fracking. It wasn't only about Pavilion, it was about other places as well, but Pavilion was one of the places that was highlighted. And that was just outside of Lander, Wyoming, where I lived for a few years in my adult life as well.
Wow. Do you remember the name of that?
Now that I'm in the hot seat, no. But
Oh, well,
but we'll look it up. Yeah, I feel in my memory it was like one of the first things that people were like, "Oh my God, they didn't know what hydraulic fracturing was until this documentary."
yeah, that's so I've never heard of it. So I'm like, now I want to go watch it for
Yeah,
myself because that's
grassland.
really
That's what it
interesting to
was.
me.
Yeah.
Grassland? Okay. All right. Everyone needs to watch Grassland after this. I will be doing that as well. That's homework that I promised everyone after this. I want to know too, like from your experience, growing up in this town where it was like so spacious and like wide open to seeing that kind of just like mass, I guess, attraction and like gravitating into the town. Like, what are the biggest changes that you feel like you saw? Was there like a large change in like the wildlife? Was like what impact did that have on the town besides like bodies,
Hmm.
like a lot of people?
Well, outside of the town, there was a lot of like roadkill because the truck traffic on the highway goes up, and it wasn't until later that people started to realize that actually that area was a huge migration corridor for pronghorn. And so as development moved in, it just started narrowing the the migration corridor, and so more and more pronghorn were getting hit by vehicles. There were impacts to sage grouse habitat. The biggest all encompassing impact that probably everybody in the region noticed, not in Rock Springs, but in the town just on the northern end of kind of where all this development was happening, Pinedale, Wyoming, there were ground level ozone exceedances. So ground level ozone is formed because of like the emissions from the production operations, and we would get these wintertime inversions that would trap all of those emissions and cause situations where we had ozone levels that were comparable to LA, like right on the flank of the Wind Rivers in this tiny little town in this totally rural valley. And that was because we have these gas lines that are leaking, we have generators that are running, we have truck traffic. That was a big thing, and that really persisted through my high school and undergrad years. And it wasn't until after I graduated grad school and went back to work in Wyoming kind of around 2013 that things started to improve because the EPA got involved and started requiring certain measures to be taken to reduce some of those emissions. But that was really big. And then just like when I was in high school, like I mentioned, the whole town changed. I ran cross country and track, and I would go, and I was a distance runner. So we wouldn't stay on the track for practice. We'd go run around town. And I really thought it was normal to be like catcalled and harassed and like have things thrown at you from trucks. It was just
Yeah.
like the kind of population that it attracted was not great.
Yeah, I can relate to that because I grew up in a really small town that was very rural, and it was such a turnoff to me to go running through town or like anything like that just based off of my experiences, which I think is part of the reason that I'm kind of so anti-road now is because of these experiences that I had where I was like that I just hate it so much, but I'm like maybe not everyone has that experience either. Maybe it's just
Yeah.
like, like the demographic or like the outlook, I guess, that some people have in like smaller regions or something. But I can relate to you in that capacity that it was, not ideal. And then you kind of go out into the bigger world and you're like, oh, not everyone necessarily has had these exact experiences as me, or to maybe the level that
Yeah,
I did.
totally. Yeah. People like value outdoor recreation here. Like it's normal for somebody to be
Yes.
on the side of the road on their own 2 feet.
Yes. Yes. Like they're moving their bodies. It's okay. We see them. It's
Yeah.
fine. Nothing to see here. And I wanted to touch base too on, okay, I should circle back first and say that all of that's really interesting, especially the inversions and like all of the different impacts that you saw, just especially in such a small region, that would be happening. And I guess just in my mind, I'm like, I can't really fathom being around like, like the gas leaks and everything, like that feeling healthy. Like, did you feel like when you were out running cross country and stuff, did you feel that in your lungs? Like, were there days where you're like, oh, the air quality's so bad?
Not really. I mean, the main inversions were kind of north of the town. So my hometown was like where everybody lived, but all the activity was kind of
Okay.
north of us. And so I didn't live in Pinedale, but I imagine if I did live in Pinedale, I would have felt it because there would be literal warnings for people not to go outside certain days in the wintertime because it would be bad for your lungs. And especially if you were young or somebody who already had a pre-existing respiratory illness. So, not for me personally, but not very far from me, that was very much the case.
Yeah, that was a reality. Yeah. Okay. So you see this change happening, and then it sparks this interest that you want to go and pursue this as an undergrad degree. Did you know going into college, like exactly what you wanted to pursue, or like what did that look like for you to kind of carve that path out?
No, I didn't know exactly. I knew that this was kind of an area that I was interested in. And honestly, when I first went to college, I didn't know it was an area that you could study. I mean, when I say that I came at this from like a totally ignorant place that just was sort of brought to my awareness by my changing surroundings, like it's so true. Like I wasn't, my whole family growing up was conservative. Like I had family members working in the coal mines and family members working in the oil and gas fields. And so I didn't even know that this was a career choice or a career option. And so I spent my first semester in undergrad at the University of Wyoming studying criminal justice and philosophy. And the reason for that was because I was like, oh, I want to be a lawyer. And so I'm just like, my high school brain is like, to be a lawyer, I should study criminal justice. And then somebody told me that majoring in philosophy would help me with the LSAT, which is like the entry exam you have to take for law school. So that's where I started. And a semester into that, I quickly learned that was not the sort of crowd that I wanted to be around. Not so much the philosophy crowd, but like I thought that the criminal justice crowd was challenging. I felt like I was already sitting in a room full of police officers, and like nothing against police officers, but I do not share that kind of intense personality type, I guess is like how I would describe it. And I had a really good friend at the time who's she's still a good friend of mine, but we were friends all through high school. She was a couple years older than me. And she was like, all the stuff that I know you care about, like there is a program for that, and you should think about just changing your major. And so really I owe her a lot for helping me realize that I could change majors and that this other career field existed. So thanks, Caitlin.
There's her shout out. And then you were doing part-time conservation work during this time too, right? So
Mhm.
I'm curious of like what kind of conservation projects you did, and if there was anything that kind of stuck out to you that were like, oh, I really want to kind of like go in this direction more so than something else.
Yeah, I was super lucky. I got to so the Environment and Natural Resources program at the University of Wyoming has its own department, and so I was fortunate enough to get a student job there, and I started out there just doing like paperwork. I was making copies and like cleaning the bathrooms and like not doing anything that was extremely relevant per se, but just being in that environment around, because the department they didn't just teach about environmental laws and issues and collaboration and all of that. They also, it was housed within the Ruckelshaus Institute, which is like, they did a lot of research and they did a lot of facilitating of like collaborative processes in natural resource disputes, et cetera. So I got to be in that environment around people who were doing that work, and I learned a lot about it because I would still be included in like board meetings and staff meetings. And so from there I kind of learned more about different environmental issues and got to meet people who could help me advance in this general direction as a career. And so the department also started housing something called the Wyoming Conservation Corps. And so I worked for them as a crew leader for 2 summers, and that was really eye-opening. That was like basically what they do is they're still in existence today, but they partner with state and federal agencies to do projects out on the land that wouldn't otherwise get done because federal and state agencies have limited resources. Our legislatures or Congress give them limited dollars to staff and take care of different issues. And so we would go out for a much cheaper price, and I think even sometimes for free. We were part of AmeriCorps, so I had like $1,000 stipend a month in college. That was like fine.
Yeah.
And would go out and do like fence conversions where you take like wildlife unfriendly fencing and turn it into wildlife friendly fencing. So that would include like removing the bottom wire of barbed wire on a barbed wire fence and replacing it with smooth wire, because even though pronghorn can physically like leap large distances and heights, they prefer to go under the fence. And so it would help sort of with that bottleneck issue around migration corridors that I talked about earlier. It helps because they can get through fence lines a lot more easily. We would do things like trail work. We would go into beetle kill areas and help to clear dead trees. Beetle kill is a huge problem in the lodgepole pine forests in Wyoming, and they become safety hazards because when the trees die, they risk falling. So we would go to like campgrounds or parking areas and cut those trees down so they were less of a fire hazard and less of a safety hazard in general.
Yeah.
That was really like I got to work with different agencies. I got an idea of like how funding works and doesn't work. And it was just a good general introduction to the very, very broad interdisciplinary field of environmentalism.
So after you graduated, you moved back to Wyoming, or you ended up working with conservative lawmakers and regulators with oil and gas related issues. So I'm curious of how that went for you, and
Yeah.
just like what that was like working with conservative lawmakers. And obviously I kind of tie it back to when you said that, you grew up with a pretty conservative family, so I feel like that probably lent to your benefit
Mhm.
of being able to understand viewpoints and like just being able to have those open conversations and being able to navigate those conversations, because I can imagine that they aren't always easy to have and that they could get heated pretty easily, especially working towards, wanting to conserve versus utilize or use up natural resources or go into spaces with like, when they're on tribal lands and things like that. Like, I'm sure there's a lot involved. So I'm very curious for you just to share about what that experience was like.
Yeah, so after I graduated from the University of Wyoming with my bachelor's degree, I came to Flagstaff to Northern Arizona University, and that's where I got my master's in environmental science and policy. And then after that, I went back to Wyoming and I worked for a statewide environmental organization there called the Wyoming Outdoor Council. And yeah, like basically, the state of Wyoming is very conservative and, like I mentioned, very energy focused. And so it's sort of mandatory in a way to work in the conservation field to be able, it sort of like forced me to try to put myself in a position where I could find common ground with people that I don't fundamentally agree with on various subjects. And so I guess like what that looked like, there's a lot of listening, and you hope that you find, and I did find some good people who like we don't agree on a lot of things, but we could listen to each other and understand each other's interests. And I mean, for me, like one of the, I guess as one example, when I was up there, I worked a lot on oil and gas issues. And one of the issues is methane emissions. So like when a company is drilling an oil well, like we call them oil wells or gas wells, but really oil and gas come up. Both of them do, no matter what well you've drilled. And it's just whatever the company is after. So if they're after oil because oil prices are higher, then that means the gas that comes up with the oil is not really what they were looking for. They're not super interested in it. And so they might, rather than install extra infrastructure like pipelines to transport that natural gas from the oil well to a facility that can still process it and create it or turn it into a marketable product, they would instead do what's called flaring or venting. So flaring is when you release the gas, but you burn it as you're releasing it. And that changes the gas from methane to CO2 and water. So in the climate world, if you're familiar with greenhouse gases, we always talk about carbon. Carbon dioxide is a greenhouse gas. Methane is also a greenhouse gas, and it happens to be much stronger than carbon dioxide at trapping heat in the atmosphere. And so, from a climate standpoint, if you have natural gas being emitted, it's better to burn it and convert it to mostly carbon dioxide than to just release it raw into the atmosphere. And that's called venting. And so that was one of the issues that I worked on a lot up in Wyoming. And really the conversation centered around like, okay, people don't want to talk about climate change up here, but people do want to talk about dollars. And so let's talk about
Right.
how much money is being lost, not just for the company when you when you just vent or flare the natural gas rather than collecting it, but also the state charges and the federal government charges a royalty on natural gas and oil that's extracted from federal lands. So if they're extracting it and selling it, the state and the federal government gets a royalty. If they're extracting it and just venting it or flaring it and not selling it, then the state and the federal government get $0. And so there are conversations to be had from the economic standpoint about why this makes sense. Yes, it costs money to put in the infrastructure to collect the gas and sell it, but that would pay for itself over time.
Right.
And at least that was the conversation we were having back in 2013 to 2015. And it's still part of the conversation now, but obviously there's the need to just move away from fossil fuels in general is as urgent as ever.
Right. I'm interested too of like how you navigate those kinds of conversations of trying to, convince somebody that stepping away from fossil fuels is the right move, or like trying to say like, look at these other options we have that potentially could still make them money. It's just something that they aren't used to utilizing, or like how do you navigate those conversations? I imagine that they would be really like almost adrenaline inducing. Like they would be really hard
Yeah.
sometimes to have them. But I feel like you have the perfect nature for this, and it's good that you're not a lawyer because you're absolutely like the person to be having them. Like you have a very like calming way of talking, and I feel like you would be able to keep your head
Thanks for
in a
saying
conversation.
that. Yeah, I mean, I hope that that's true. I guess it's just really an imperfect situation. It just depends on the person that you're
Yeah.
talking to. Honestly, there are some people that you really just can't have the conversation because they're not even willing to go in that direction. I mean,
Yeah.
at some point, it's like the science and the facts are what they are. And if you disagree
Right.
with that for some reason, like there's not much to be said because once you lose that common foundation of like, this is what the science says and this is what the facts are, then we're kind of in
Yeah.
a
Yeah.
much different place. But for people who at least acknowledge the basic, well known just fact that the climate is changing and that humans are contributing to it, then there's room for conversation. And oftentimes it does bridge into that economic realm. And that's to some extent, that's okay. Like we live in a capitalist society, and I know people have differing views about whether or not that is a good thing. But given the
That is very
situation,
healthy.
that's like where we are, and people have to put food on the table. And so if you can have a genuine conversation around, okay, well, how about we figure out other ways that we can make money or diversify the economy so that the only source of putting food on the table is not this kind of harmful practice. And that's like
Yeah.
much easier said than done. I actually don't, I mean, I don't come to you like with being able to say like, oh, and I've solved this for people. Like I definitely haven't. It's just,
If you had all the answers, you wouldn't be just an energy director.
yeah.
You'd be like the all knowing.
Yeah. Yeah, but I think in the end, like how you have these conversations is just acknowledging people's humanity and not assuming the worst out of them. So one of the best pieces of advice that one of my mentors in Wyoming gave me was like, try not to think about the thing that the person is doing or saying that's making you mad, and instead imagine like in the case of a state legislator who like constantly infuriated me, my mentor was like, just think of what a good grandfather he is. Like, don't think about all of the talking points he's just conveying from the coal companies or whatever it is. Think about what a great grandfather he is, and then like let's go from there, because you can't have a conversation calling people what they don't believe of themselves. Like you can't say you don't care about your grandchildren, because surely he does. He just
Yeah.
has different ideas of what caring about them means.
That's really great advice. And yeah, just like looking for the heart of the matter, like looking for the heart in the person, like remembering that we're all human and we're all driven by different things too, even though we may not be driven by the same things, which can be really infuriating. And it's really hard to be like, why don't you care about this the way that I care about this? It seems so clear in my mind, like everyone should care about this the same way. But if you're able to find that common ground of like what makes us all human, then it potentially makes it easier to at least come from an angle where like you're just talking to each other as people instead of like with these different agendas, I guess,
Yeah.
which I imagine would be very challenging for you, but
Yeah. I'm
I love
not
that.
perfect by any means.
Yeah, yeah, of course, none of us are, but I feel like it was destined for you to be that instead of a lawyer for sure. I want to navigate to like in your bio, you talk about your first experience like going on the Colorado River in the Grand Canyon and how that kind of like propelled you towards working for like water policy. Is that an accurate thing to say?
Yeah, I mean, I always kind of knew that there were water issues, but like around the time that I traveled down the Colorado River, I was also just reading about like the politics that were behind how Colorado River water had been originally allocated and how like we knew all along that there wasn't going to be enough water, but we just ignored it. And so that I would say that that was a piece of what made me start to wonder like we've grown up with this thought that like we're protected by the laws and regulations that govern our society, and our government or our leaders wouldn't let anything happen that would really hurt us. And it started to become clear to me that that's not true. And that in some ways, as helpful and as positive as those rules and regulations and statutes are, it's also dangerous because for a lot of people who don't have the privilege of spending the time day in and day out thinking about this and looking more closely at the details, it's like a false security blanket. Like you think there's no way my groundwater could be contaminated because we have the Safe Drinking Water Act. And it's just the reality of it is just much more complicated once you look at the details.
That literally reminds me of Ash Davidson's book. Like, and I know that you're friends. So that just, it reminds me of that whenever you're thinking like, the government would never do something. They would never agree to something or testing a product on, the land or the water that could hurt me.
Mhm.
There's no way that they would just kind of look the other way or like not approve it or put it through processes because like they would have our back. And it has to be really hard to start to realize that that's
Yeah, yeah. I mean, the reality is that our decisions are made by politicians, and those politicians are put in their positions of power by dollars, by donations. And it's the big companies that have the dollars to give in that case. And so the reality is that, our representatives do represent us. They also represent big corporations that have bottom lines to defend. And so
yeah.
it really is critical that, we as a society do everything we can to help each other understand what's really happening and to be able to work together to kind of interrupt the paths that we can sometimes go down. And again, acknowledging that like everybody comes from different levels of privilege, and I am very privileged to be able to do this work and get paid for it. And I cannot imagine if I was a single mom working two jobs trying to just put food on the table and keep a roof over my kids' heads and try to like keep track of this stuff and stay informed as a voting citizen. And so
Yeah.
those of us who are in these positions of privilege, it's really important that we help bring information or make information more accessible and easy to act on by those who don't necessarily have that time.
Yes, I completely agree. And that's my hope too, is even with this, is just like have an avenue where people can just have access to information that maybe they've never heard, or like, this could be someone's first experience even learning about fracking or uranium mining, or like, they may have never even heard of it because I think so many people, it's like, we're so focused on just getting through the day to day, or you're trying to think about where your rent money's coming from, or can I pay for gas right now because it's so expensive. Like there's just so much happening that so many people don't seek out this information, or they don't know where to
Mm-hmm.
start, and it can be really overwhelming to even try to find these educational articles and stuff. Like a lot of people, I feel like they don't know even where to start.
Mm-hmm.
So I would also be curious to know if you have any books or anything that you read that would be good for someone who is potentially starting to want to learn about what's happening in the canyon, or,
Mhm.
learning about water access, or like the potential drought, or the foreseen drought, not potential, it's going to happen, but,
Mhm.
just like what is happening, like if you have any good resources that you would recommend for someone who potentially wants to kind of start down that path.
Oh man. Well, there are undoubtedly many, but but I guess sort of selfishly, like the Grand Canyon Trust's website is a great place to go, like because we publish a lot of this stuff in blogs. So that's like a really quick way to get a 600 word summary of an issue or update on an issue without having to go back and read like endless news articles or whatever. Um, which is also good. I mean, I feel like I have this like kind of tiny, maybe big addiction to like just listening to National Public Radio and like some of the national papers of record, like the New York Times and the Washington Post. Those have been good resources for me. And I also think that there are and this is another place where the trust's website can help direct people, but there are people like in indigenous communities who are telling their stories that maybe aren't necessarily published in a book, or they're not in every news article, but they're important perspectives that can really help people understand kind of what's going on. And when it comes to uranium mining, I mean, those voices are the ones that probably should be heard the loudest and the most, because disproportionately uranium mining and milling and disposal in the United States has impacted indigenous communities, whether on Navajo Nation or in southeastern Utah in like the Ute Mountain Ute tribe.
Yeah, I would love to segue right here just into like tell us what the Grand Canyon Trust is, and like what you cover, what projects are you specifically focusing on, like where, and then I would love for you to explain like what uranium mining
Yeah.
is and start.
Yeah. So the Grand Canyon Trust, our mission area is the whole Colorado Plateau. So if you're not familiar with the Colorado Plateau, it straddles four states: Utah, Colorado, New Mexico, and Arizona. It's kind of like if you think about some of the more famous like southwestern national parks like Arches or Grand Canyon National Park or Zion, like all of that is on the Colorado Plateau. Um, and the plateau is also home to at least 15 indigenous tribes and nations. And so at the trust, we have a variety of program areas, and it's weird to describe it as a program area because we try not to be super siloed within our different departments. But there's the energy program, which I direct. We have our cultural landscapes program, which focuses on like Bears Ears and issues in southeastern Utah. We have a Native America program that really is like an umbrella program with all the different program areas kind of work with the Native America program to make sure that we're coming at our work from the right lens. And we're just starting a water program. So the issues that we work on, it's a long list. But in the energy world, we focus on uranium mining on the Colorado Plateau. We especially focus on uranium mining around the Grand Canyon, and we focus on federal uranium mining policy as well as just hard rock mining policy in general. So uranium is it falls into the hard rock mining category, but there are other things like all the minerals that are needed to manufacture renewable energy. Like those are mined as hard rock minerals, and it just so happens that the hard rock mining law of 1872 is what it sounds like. It's literally turns 150 years old this year, and it's very antiquated, and that's what governs uranium mining, lithium mining, copper mining, etc. So yeah, that's kind of I guess where I focus at the trust.
I just want to know like an introductory level, if someone's never heard of like what is
Mm-hmm.
uranium and what does uranium mining look like why is it something that's an
Mm-hmm.
issue in the Colorado Plateau area. So I would love to just start
Yeah.
there.
So uranium it's a very common metal found in the Earth's crust, but it's found in higher quantities in some places than others. It's a radioactive metal, so that means that well, essentially you don't want radioactive particles from uranium mining or milling or disposal to find their way into your body, because they lodge there, and as they're decaying, they emit gamma rays, which alters DNA and causes things like stomach cancer, kidney failure, lung cancer, um, like really horrible fatal diseases. Um, and uranium has been mined in the Southwest since around like the 40s, 50s decades. And the reason that it's mined is primarily used for nuclear power, nuclear bombs, and then some small quantities, relatively small quantities, are used for like medical purposes, in different machinery and things like that. So in the 50s and 60s, when uranium mining was really booming in the Southwest, it was booming because the United States government was really seeking uranium for the purposes of building bombs. We were really excited about the about nuclear bombs. And so at the time, the federal government was incentivizing mining by paying $10,000 bonuses, which was a lot back then. I mean, it's still a lot, just for discovering it. And so there was a lot of uranium mining that happened on the Navajo Nation, and there was a lot of misinformation. Like, the federal government had started to understand that there were negative health impacts from exposure, but just kind of conveniently didn't tell Navajo people that this was a risk. And they got Navajo residents to help them find uranium deposits and mine it. And in the end, that wasn't really cleaned up. So today, there are over 500 abandoned uranium mines still out there on the Navajo Nation, like just open, contaminating groundwater, contaminating the landscape. And so today there are people on the Navajo Nation who, they're our age. They weren't alive when this stuff was mined, and they're experiencing health impacts related to this. An ongoing study that's happening called the Navajo Birth Cohort Study found in 2019 that over a quarter of the over 700 participants in their study had elevated levels of uranium in their bloodstream compared to the rest of the U.S. population. And so there's a huge legacy, and it's not just on the Navajo Nation, it's throughout the Southwest, but that is especially egregious. So there were also over 20 uranium mills, because once you mine the uranium, you have to take it to a mill to crush the rock and pull the actual uranium out of what it is sort of embedded with in nature to be able to sort of start to refine uranium to make it usable. Because obviously you're not taking uranium and all the rock and doing something with it. You just want to
Right.
purify it more. And so the legacy is huge. There's been uranium mining around the Grand Canyon in the past. There's one mine that's actually within the national park boundaries. So you actually can't mine within a national park. The mining happened when it was a national park, but the actual claim was there before the national park came to be. So it's complicated, but they were allowed to mine. The company just left, didn't clean it up. And on top of that, the hydrology around the Grand Canyon is super complex. It's highly fractured. We don't really understand groundwater flow. So it's really hard to say, like, if contamination were to happen here, we know exactly where it would come out. So therefore we know how we could clean it up or manage it. That's a problem generally, but around the Grand Canyon, it's even more complex because of the nature of the geology. And so there's all but proven contamination from the mine in Horn Creek. So if you're hiking on the Tonto Trail or running on the Tonto Trail, you're not supposed to drink the water from Horn Creek because there are elevated levels of uranium there. And when I say all but proven, it's that we're pretty sure that it's kind of that contamination came from the mine. The only difference, the only thing that's lacking is like a signature of what uranium contamination from that mine would look like compared to the signature of the uranium in the. So I'm really going on, but the legacy is there, um,
I mean,
and now we're in this place where uranium mining companies still want to mine. So around the Grand Canyon, there is At one point in like 2010, there were over 10,000 mining claims on Bureau of Land Management and Forest Service lands adjacent to, so north and south of Grand Canyon National Park. These are lands that are hydrologically connected to the Grand Canyon. And because of that 1872 mining law that I mentioned, there's not a way for the public or tribes to be like, no, don't mine here, short of an act of Congress or getting the President of the United States themselves to do something. And so those 10,000 mining claims raised a lot of alarm, knowing what has happened in the past with uranium mining and the problems that are still persisting today. And so the Obama administration in 2012 declared a temporary administrative mining ban for 20 years that would prevent new mines or mining claims from being placed in the region. There's still one mine that was grandfathered into that. It's now called the Pinyon Plain Mine. It used to be called the Canyon Mine, but the mining company changed the name because they were tired of being associated with Grand Canyon, even though they're about 9 miles as the crow flies from the south rim of the Grand Canyon. They are within the shadow of Red Butte, which is kind of off to your right if you're driving to the south rim. And it's a traditional cultural property for the Havasupai tribe. It's a highly significant landscape for the tribe, and that mine is allowed to go forward by the federal government despite this mining ban that's in place. So and there are other uranium developments and threats across the plateau. There's also the White Mesa Uranium Mill in southeastern Utah. It's owned by the same company that owns Pinyon Plain Mine. It's called Energy Fuels Resources, and they operate what was supposed to be a conventional uranium mill to process natural uranium ore for about 15 years. They opened in like 1980. And so by 1995-ish, they should have closed down. They have over 200 acres. I think it's like 275 acres of these tailings impoundments that hold radioactive and toxic waste that will stay there forever. Once the mill is gone, they will basically bury it and cap it and move on. And the mill is just a few miles up gradient of the Ute Mountain Ute community of White Mesa. There's confirmed contamination below the mill. The company denies responsibility for it. The liners that are within these huge tailings impoundments, most of the liners are just single PVC lining, so just plastic lining that some, what do you call them? Like, if you were to look up how long something like that should last, it's like maybe 30 years. And so the mill's been there for over 40. So this community is really concerned that their groundwater is going to, if not now, eventually become contaminated because of this mill. And they have continued to reinvent themselves. They now process radioactive waste from around the country and the world that they're allowed. So this is another example, right, of where there are laws that you think protect you, but actually there's some sort of loophole for that for bad things to happen. And in this case, it's regulated like a uranium mill, when they have actually started accepting radioactive waste from all around the country and from places like Estonia and Japan, where because they accept this waste and they run it through the mill to pull out trace amounts of uranium and thorium, which are usually less than 1% of what the full like volume of stuff that they're accepting. Because they run it through the mill to produce that small amount of uranium and thorium, magically the rest of that radioactive waste, when it comes out the other end of the mill, is uranium mill tailings, and it's not the radioactive waste that it was before it came in. And so so it just goes into those impoundments as if it was uranium mill tailings, and it gets to stay there forever. And the places that send that material to the White Mesa Mill are paying the White Mesa Mill a fee to accept that waste. And so the mill makes millions of dollars a year in doing that. And all of this is just right next door to the Ute Mountain Ute community. And so there's been interest in, especially recently, in ramping up uranium production, especially with the war in Ukraine, because the United States gets about 16% of its uranium from Russia. And so, rightfully so, nobody wants to give Russia another dime. But that has become an opportunity for these domestic uranium companies to be like, don't worry, we got you. We're gonna produce uranium instead. And what that really means is that these operations that are right next door to tribal communities on the plateau are stand to be impacted and to carry that burden instead.
Wow. I feel like I'm just like, yeah, I'm almost at a loss for words of just like how deeply impacted these communities are, like how that this is happening right now, and that even people that have not even, been next to an active mine are still being impacted long term. Like this is like an ancestral thing that they're going to carry on because of the decisions that are being made.
Mm-hmm.
Um, it's like shell shock, I think almost. I'm just, in my mind, I'm just like, how does that continue to be allowed? Like
Mm-hmm.
if there is evidence, and like there are these ongoing studies happening that are showing the impacts of negative impacts that are causing disease and causing all of these things, like how does this continue
Mm-hmm.
to be okay?
Mm-hmm.
Like what does that look like? Because you're talking to these communities and you're working closely with them, and they're telling you these stories, and obviously like advocating for them and advocating for change and like not allowing these to move forward, but then it still does. Like
Mm-hmm.
what does that look like? Like why does that, what's the loophole there
Yeah.
that they continue to work?
Well, I mean, part of the problem is that we're so our whole structure is very reactive. So I mentioned the 1872 mining law before. That law declares things like uranium mining to be the highest and best use of the land. So um, it is the priority usage above cultural uses, above recreational uses. So, in order to stop something like that going forward, like we still have to go through the Environmental Policy Review, National Environmental Policy Act review process. But in the end, if you can't prove beyond a reasonable doubt that that operation is going to contaminate groundwater above drinking water standards or whatever the case might be, then there's nothing to be done until that harm occurs. And then at that point, I mean, in the case of uranium, it's really dangerous because, like I mentioned, the half life is 4.5 billion years. Technically, in very controlled situations, we have like techniques for cleaning up uranium contamination, but the reality of that is very different. So, I mean, just as an example, some of those uranium mills that I mentioned that operated over the years, they have big plumes of contamination beneath them. And it's either technically impossible or just economically infeasible to clean them up. And so the way that they're being managed is to just constantly pump groundwater to keep the plume from growing and extending beyond where it already is. So the idea that if contamination occurs, we can just clean it up is honestly BS. There's just no practical way to clean up that mess once it already happens. And we're also asking communities to suffer an impact before we're really interested in doing anything. I mean, part of what we're doing at the trust is trying to change the paradigm, I guess, in some ways, where we've also, just as a country, for so many years, like our entire existence, we have silenced the voices of these communities that have different views. They have just different cultures, different ways of looking at the world. They have centuries and centuries of traditional knowledge and understanding of the environment that they live in. And here, here's the United States government saying, this is Western science, this is like what we listen to. And if you don't want to tell me, for instance, like what specific spiritual harm you're going to be caused by this mine going in place, then like tough luck. And so we really have a lot of work to do as a society to change the way that decisions are made and to really bring these impacted community members and leaders to the table of decision making, rather than kind of making them be an outside party. Like, tribes are not stakeholders. Tribes are sovereign nations, and they deserve to be at the table where the decision is being made, not outside the room and allowed to talk for 5 minutes.
Yeah, and centering their experiences,
Mm-hmm.
centering their knowledge, because they're being directly impacted at every turn. Like it's mind blowing to me that we're still there. Like we're still, this is our table. We're gonna have this discussion. What you say doesn't matter. it's not what we want to hear, so we're just not going to.
Hmm.
It breaks my heart, especially, we both live here, so it's like we see the impacts, and like obviously like Navajo Nation is right here,
Hmm.
so it's like we could easily go drive and like see the impacts right
Hmm.
now if we wanted to. And it's just gutting to know that like the entire nation, the entire community is just being like silenced and told to be quiet and sit down, basically.
Hmm.
um, and I think like the biggest thing that like ask in my head when I'm listening to this is like, well, like what do we do, like as citizens, like what are the steps we can
Hmm.
take to use our voice, to use our privilege, to use our power to create change.
Hmm.
So, like, what steps would you recommend for someone who's listened to this and hopefully feels as impassioned as I do, like
Hmm.
that we should be, pushing for these policies to change, these efforts to move forward. Like, we need to be using our voices for people that are not being listened to.
Hmm.
Like, they're not allowed to be heard, so we have to demand it.
Hmm. Yeah, I think it depends. I mean, there are lots of things a person can do. You can donate to Native organizations. You can contact your members of Congress and make it clear that you know about this issue and you think that tribes should be listened to. I think for some people who have like higher followings, like on Instagram or, you know, I think about this all the time when I'm thinking about like in the running world, there are pro runners out there with huge platforms that could use that platform to elevate these stories. Like when, say, a tribal council chairman or chairwoman writes an op ed explaining this issue and the impact, like let's amplify that to the broader community and to networks that maybe that person doesn't just naturally fall into. So I think as much as we can elevate those voices, as much as we can contact our representatives in elected leadership positions and emphasize these issues, I mean, it affects all of us, and everybody has a story to tell, whether it's an economic one, a spiritual one, a recreational one, or just a moral one. I think we all have a role to play. And at a bare minimum, if, I mean, everybody has their own lives and their own busy schedules. And I mean, at a bare minimum, you can sign up for action alerts at grandcanyontrust.org and get an email whenever an opportunity comes up where there's a comment period or an opportunity to send a letter or sign on to a petition or something like that that will help you know without you having to track what the opportunities are.
Yeah. Do you have any, just like kind of off the cuff, but are there any Native organizations
Mhm.
that you know of that you would direct people to donate to?
Yeah, there's one organization called Hall No that focuses on uranium transportation across Navajo Nation and other tribal nations. There's an organization called Dene Care. Those are the top ones that come to mind, but I can think of others and send them along to you.
Are people able to donate directly to the trust?
Yeah, they can donate directly to the trust as well. We're not a Native organization. We support Native communities, but I should just be clear that we're not a Native organization. But I mean, there are also just like community members out there that are doing this work that aren't necessarily part of a nonprofit, like the White Mesa Concerned Community. I actually don't know off the top of my head if they have a way of accepting donations, but that's just another entity that could use amplification. You can follow them on Facebook and share the issues that get discussed there. It's pretty much always about the White Mesa Mill and the impacts that that community faces. Yeah, I'm trying to think of others off the top of my head, but those are the main ones.
Yeah, thank you so much. I feel like I've learned so much in an hour. And also just like, we've had discussions and I feel like I've kind of scratched the surface, but there's just so much more to all of these issues than, I could even imagine, even the history of it, just how long this has been occurring and like how many are impacted. Like it's just mind blowing. So I really appreciate you taking time to just like raise awareness and advocate and help me share this information with even more people, because I feel like this is so important
Mhm.
for people to know about and to be speaking up for and to be protecting these spaces and these communities. Like this is so big, and it's occurring right now. And even as you said, like this is a current, even more current issue, especially with the war in Ukraine and like everything that's changing. Like these are things that we should be discussing
Mhm.
and you know alerting and using our voices for, and again using our privilege to push for change and redirection and protection of what's occurring. So thank you so much for spending time with me to share and advocate for this.
Yeah, of
um,
course. Thanks for having me.
yeah. Oh my gosh, anytime. Anytime, it's an honor for me. I do have a couple closing like wrap up questions for you. The first is where people can find
Mhm.
you on social media or on websites.
Well, I'm probably most active on Instagram, and that's just at Amber Reimondo, and my last name is spelled Reimondo. And then I do some retweeting on Twitter. Mostly it's just retweets, but I try to center those around Indigenous voices or issues that affect Indigenous communities, and that's at Amber W229.
Perfect. And then my last question for you is, what does keeping nature wild mean to you?
That's a good question.
It feels loaded every time
I
I
know,
ask it.
yeah. I mean, I think for me, to some degree, it means reevaluating what I grew up thinking wild means. Like, I'm a white person, a white woman, and so I feel like I grew up thinking that wilderness and something being wild meant that it was untouched by humans. And if there's anything that I've learned as I've grown in my career and just as a human being, it's that in fact the places that we all think about as being wild today have long complicated histories, and humans have actually had a place in them for centuries before colonization. And so I guess keeping nature wild for me means learning from and honoring the people whose history is much longer than my own on what are now our public lands that we now have the privilege of enjoying. And it means doing what I can to ensure that those people and their knowledge and perspectives are meaningfully part of the ways that those lands are now managed and cared for going forward.
I love that so much. Yeah, I feel like everyone should lean into learning history about where we walk, where we run, where we're recreating. Like we should know who tread these lands before us, who have maintained them, who have nurtured them, who continue to do
Mm-hmm.
that, who are advocating for them and not being heard. Like there is so much happening that we don't see or think to know.
Mm-hmm.
So that was beautifully said. Again, thank you so much for just sharing time with me. And it's like such an honor and a gift for me to get to like share time with you and talk to you about what you're so passionate about. I love getting to like hear you, and yeah, it definitely inspires me to learn more. And hopefully, everyone that listens is also going to leave this conversation and feel very compelled to get involved and at least do research and learn more about all of these different issues and different policies that are happening all around us right now.
Yeah.
So, thank you so
No,
much.
thank you for having me, Bree. This was so much fun.